Can everyone hear me? So good afternoon, I'm Julia Bryan-Wilson. I'm an Associate Professor of Modern and Contemporary Art in the Art History Department here at UC Berkeley, and I'm really thrilled to be part of what has been a very exciting day. Thank you so much to everyone at the Arts Research Center and to Michael Kelly for his important work on the encyclopedia. I am the moderator of this final session entitled When is Art Contemporary? And I'm going to offer some framing comments as a way to open up our conversation. I'm also going to present a little, in fact, quite brief snippet of my own thinking that's based on my current research about this question. And I was going to introduce the panelists with all their many accolades, but in the interest of time, I will direct you to the program where the bios that I was going to read appear more or less word for word, so there's no point in doing that. Oops. I also know that we have to stick to a very strict time schedule, so I'm hoping to be mindful of that. Sorry, I'm sure that sounds horrible. When is art contemporary? When preparing for this event, I thought that there were three contested terms in this very brief question. When, art, and contemporary, but Whitney Davis made me rethink the transparency of the verb is here, and I'm not sure I'm fully capable of parsing out that word with all of its philosophical ramifications today. But I will start instead with perhaps the more obvious, slippery terms in this phrase. First, the word art, obviously, which we've already discussed a little bit earlier today in terms of questions especially of class, taste, amateurism versus professionalism, and prestige. And I think there's already been a very keen elaboration of how art is constantly defined and is defining itself against other terms like perhaps participation or computing. Our panel today brings together scholars from several disciplinary homes to think through art, or the arts, in its broadest possible scope, including visual culture, dance, and film, in relation to another quite blurry term, insecure concept, which is the contemporary. I'm also really interested in the when. Within these various mediums, within these various arts, how is the present moment either historicized, that is, grounded in its own moment of production and ongoing reception, or seen as distinct from earlier time periods? How, that is, can we not only make a claim for art's temporality, but also for its relevance? So I think that embedded in the question is not just how is art contemporary, when does it start, when does the contemporary begin, but also how is it contemporary with the meaningfulness of maybe our lives. So when is art contemporary not only asks us to pinpoint dates, which is a very literal response to answering this question, but also to consider when does art unfold within and against the most pressing issues of our day? When does it matter for us to define and describe the when? What are the when's limits and its promises? When does art echo and build on previous forms and existing institutions? And when does it activate, shatter, and contribute to conversations that help us shape not just the present, but the future? In other words, when can art be an effective and material bridge from the past into the dynamic and unknowable now? Within many fields, this question of when, the when of contemporary art, is hotly debated, with arguments over the historical breaks suggested by, say, the radical social movements and formal innovations of the 1960s, and I'm showing you two examples here, one on drawing and one on dance, that take the 1960s as a specific starting point for the contemporary. In our history, in the past few years, there has been a whole cottage industry of texts about contemporary art that have proposed a dizzying array of beginnings in the service of trying to nail down exactly when the when began. So we have art since 1970, visual art after the 1980, other books, 1985, 1989, so the date keeps kind of shifting around. It's a really floating origin moment. The definition of contemporary, which suggests coexistence and mutual presence, and the dictionary definition is living or occurring in the same moment, meaning that it's an ever-shifting rubric. And you can think perhaps of people who are not yet Not still with us, artists like, for example, Felix Gonzalez Torres, who is not coexisting with us materially in the flesh, that is to say, not his living body, since he had passed away of AIDS in 1994, but is still considered a contemporary artist. So this is, I'm drawing from work that Nino Nixon has done about the paradox of the dead contemporary artist, and also the living but not seen as contemporary artist, who's often, in fact, an amateur, which I'll talk about in a second. Richard Meyer has made crucial and brilliant interventions into this conversation about the when of the contemporary in his groundbreaking book, When Was Contemporary Art, asking us to think about historical unfoldings of the contemporary in moments now historically distant from our own, namely in the early 20th century, and I look forward to hearing more thoughts from him on this topic, as well as from Sansan Kwan, who teaches in the dance department here, and Jeffrey Scholar of the Film and Media Studies department. In the book I'm finishing at the moment, I'm interested in how handicraft, such as knitting, weaving, quilting, crocheting, and sewing, warps between the past and the present, and is relentlessly recruited for pressing contemporary concerns, while simultaneously being dragged back to the traditions from which it sprang, and craft always often in dialogue with the low, with kitsch, seen really as not being innovative formally, but instead repeating a set of conventions. So in fact, often handicraft is understood as quite Janus-faced with regards to the when, that is both the most regressive and simultaneously potentially the most revolutionary. And in my book, I'm trying to be very specific and very skeptical about both of these claims. So I'm going to play a very quick clip of a video that I'll then talk about a little bit more.
Julia,
yes?
Can you just dim the lights a bit so that you can see it?
Sure.
Sarah,
I don't think I have control over that. Oh yeah, I do. How's that? More?
That's
Okay.
Hello, have you accepted craft as your way to salvation? Craft? Go sing about craft. Excuse me, have you accepted craft as your road to personal salvation? Hello, ma'am, do you have time to talk about craft today? Excuse me, sir, have you accepted craft as your road to personal salvation? Alright. You folks have time to talk about craft today?
craft?
Yes. Craft is the 21st century model that will save us from our late capitalist demise.
Okay. In this clip, a proselytizer stands on the sidewalk in Richmond, Virginia, handing out leaflets to passersby. He wears a vaguely monastic outfit that is all black, complete with old-fashioned suspenders, as he stands atop a handmade wooden soapbox, calling out, "Excuse me, sir, have you accepted craft as your road to personal salvation?" In this performance, The Gospel According to Craft from 2009, metalsmith Gabriel Craig literalizes the persistently evangelical approach to handmaking taken by some crafters in the contemporary global north, and in particular in the United States, over the last decade. And I will point out that Ted Purvis mentioned that there is a word for gamer, but there's not really a word for an arter. There is, of course, a word for crafter. Video documentation of this piece shows people streaming past Craig, mostly without comment, but when the curious stop to listen, he expounds. Craft, he says, is the 21st model that will save us from our late capitalist demise. Craft working by hand for a better tomorrow. Craig's delivery might be somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but as a self-described craft advocate, his message is totally sincere. His rhetoric echoes many entrenched ideas that handmaking can deliver us from the evils of capitalist-related alienation or economic hardship, a bright craft future. Some of his statements about craft as a way for workers to reclaim the means of production or owning things that are beautiful and functional are paraphrases of the 19th century British arts and crafts movement founder William Morris, who influentially wrote about the political nature of handiwork in the context of industrialism. As Morris exhorted in 1880, quote, "Have nothing in your homes that you do not know to be useful and believe to be beautiful," and Craig is very knowingly citing this. Utilizing a socialist framework, Morris championed craft as a gratifying form of production, one with the potential to transform the deadening effects of the wage labor system. However overheated and obviously quite silly, the religious tone Craig enacts is right on target. In the last decade, handmaking has inspired a new kind of fervor. Witness the loose network of crafters called the Church of Craft, which was founded in New York in 2000 and currently boasts more than a dozen chapters in cities in the US, England, and Canada. Dedicated to an anti-capitalist do-it-yourself ethos, the website includes a sermon by founder Kelly Janoff proclaiming making things is our spiritual practice. This unabashedly romanticized vision of craft as a tool for personal empowerment, as a community builder, and as an alternative to mass production has gained much traction during craft's resurgence over the past decade, a resurgence that has brought together young artists, hobbyists, activists, and studio makers. Craft has been triumphed as a way to create, quote, personal, social, and cultural change, stitch by stitch, to quote the subtitle of Betsy Greer's volume, Knitting for Good. Greer is often credited with coining the term craftivism, a snappy neologism that grafts activism onto craft. Yet there are many historical precedents to crafting in the social sphere for political purposes, including the feminist reclamation of domestic handiwork in the 1970s and the environmental movement's insistence on locally created artisanal goods. Even before the Industrial Revolution, crafting in public was capable of registering a political message. As historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich has chronicled, charitable spinning bees performed by women during the immediate post-Revolutionary War era were taken as a form of political resistance. In its current iterations, craftivism takes many forms, from collective Knit for Peace demonstrations to works such as Gabriel Craig's project, The Pro Bono Jeweler from 2008 to 2010. In this piece, Craig set up his small metalsmithing workshop in public and gave away silver rings that he makes on the spot to members of the public who talked to him about his process. Craig attempts to reroute jewelry making into a gift economy rather than one of commodity exchange. But craft is also a very big business, no less today than it was in William Morris's time, when his textile designs paradoxically became sought-after luxury items for the elite. Along with sales in the craft fairs that proliferate around the country, independent online retailer Etsy, which used to sell really mostly handmade goods, it's transitioned a little bit, but it was branded originally as a handmade marketplace and brought in last year $50 million in revenue. Etsy's tagline is "Shopping for meaning in a sea of stuff," a slogan that brings together consumerism and craft as it implies a search for cultural significance through the creation and, more importantly, the acquisition of objects. And this is a feature in the New York Times that talks about how people who quit their jobs to work for themselves on Etsy actually end up working 80 hours a week. So that hobby looks like a lot of work. How is the new generation of young crafters negotiating the twin imperatives of entrepreneurialism and meaningful making in this manufactured sea of stuff? Especially given neoliberal imperatives to brand yourself within what Greg Cholette calls enterprise culture, we all have to market ourselves now, and crafting has become ever more a business. How can we measure the shifting use value of craft when such creation is also imbued with what Michael Hart calls affective labor? Labor practices beyond the making of commodities that generate subjectivities and sociality. As Hart writes, affective labor is better understood by beginning from what feminist analyses of women's work have called labor in the bodily mode. These questions resonate within other spheres of cultural work, of course, but because craft traditionally has strong connections to the hand, to the domestic, and to skill, and to amateurism, they are suggestive when directed to artists whose methods highlight handmaking. At a time when crafting is both a booming marketplace and for some a possible site of anti-capitalist resistance, or at least that is the overwhelming rhetoric, many artists are using conventional craft techniques and materials not to make saleable things, but to highlight the physical and collective processes of production. And I'm interested in teasing out what I'm calling in my book the currency of craft. That is to say, not only its contemporaneity, but also its charge, its almost electrical ability to act as a temporal conduit, moving us from the past into affective realms of mutual aliveness. And I'm mostly in the book talking about work that was made in the 70s and the 80s because I'm interested in that historical moment when craft occupied a very unstable cultural almost erasure because it was before this kind of resurgence in the last decade. But in my afterword, I do examine projects, more recent projects like this one, which is Liz Collins's Knitting Nation, in which an army of machine knitters churned out a large rainbow flag that spooled out on the ground, in part to demystify textile production, but also to raise questions, very critical questions about the commercialization of queer culture. And I'm interested in the conjunction between craft time and queer time. And I'm thinking about how queer temporalities that are somewhat nonlinear also ramify within craft procedures, especially with these kind of anachronistic collisions. Debates about the contemporary, the when of it, I suppose, are happening, that is to say, within the arena of craft theory that I'm very much embedded in. They also are happening within the visual arts, as my example showed, but those conversations don't often interface with simultaneous debates occurring in dance or in film, where I know that the question of the relevance of terms like modernism and postmodernism take very different shapes. So that's part of what I think is so exciting about this panel, which is that we are coming out a little bit of our usual entrenched disciplines to survey and map not only what might be overlapping territory, but also very unfamiliar terrain. So now I'm going to turn things over to our first speaker, who I think will be Richard Meyer.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks to everyone who put the symposium together today. It's nice to be back at Berkeley. So yeah, I wrote a little something that I think is relevant. In 1963, Andy Warhol, this little presentation is called Ethel Scull's Contemporaneity, or A Portrait of Being Alive. In 1963, Andy Warhol received the first portrait commission of his career, and it was from Robert Scull, the wealthy owner of a New York City taxi fleet, who paid Warhol to do a portrait of his, that is, Robert Scull, not Andy Warhol, of his wife, Ethel. At the appointed day, Warhol met Scull at her uptown Fifth Avenue apartment. Mrs. Scull wore an Yves Saint Laurent for Christian Dior suit in the expectation that she would be photographed, that she would sit for a photographic session with Warhol in the lavishly appointed living room of the residence. And then from those photographs, Warhol would make a silkscreen portrait. Instead, Warhol told his patron that she had to come with him immediately as a cab was waiting outside with the meter running. And now I'm going to quote from Ethel Scull's recollection of that day. And I said, "Where are we going?" And then they're speaking back and forth, so you'll just have to imagine Ethel Scull and Warhol exchanging, without me constantly saying Ethel. And Ethel said, "Well, where are we going?" Warhol, "Just down to 42nd Street and Broadway." I said, "What are we going to do there?" He said, "I'm going to take pictures of you." I said, "For what?" He said, "For the portrait." I said, "In those things," meaning automated photo booths, which she associated with the arcades in Times Square. "My God, I'll look terrible." He said, "Don't worry," and took out coins. He had about $100 worth of silver coins. And he said, "Well, we'll take the high key and the low key, and I'll push you inside, and you watch the little red light. The thing," end quote, "the thing you do with the passport with 3/4 or something like that." He said, "Just watch the red light." And I froze. I watched the red light and never did anything. So Andy would come in and poke me and make me do all kinds of things, and I finally relaxed. I think the whole place, wherever we were, thought that they had two nuts in there. We were running from one booth to another, and he took all these pictures, and they were drying all over the place in the Penny Arcade. I'm showing you here Warhol's instructions. This is a study, actually an instruction to the printer as to how Warhol wanted these to be printed in order to make a silkscreen, which he would then apply the colors to. This says, "Mr. Golden, make contrast like before, black and white, Rush, Andy Warhol." And I think it is interesting, actually, to borrow a word from Julia, to see how these portraits, which are so often understood as immediate and strictly photographic, were in fact very carefully controlled and crafted by Warhol, even though he claimed otherwise. And the final portrait, I'm going to just make it a little darker because I really want you to be able to see it. This is Ethel Scull 36 times, now in the collection of the Whitney Museum of American Art, one of the great Warhols, I think. The diversity of color and stance in Ethel Scull's portrait emphasizes the range of her theatrical femininity, the ways in which, with just a minimum of props, like her sunglasses, her hand, her suit, she can project a seemingly infinite number of affects: high glamour, hilarity, hairdo check. The pleasures of repetition in Scull's portrait have to do with the ways in which recurrence plays off against difference, the ways in which each image both mimics and differentiates itself from a chain of adjacent shots, as in a filmic sequence of an object in motion, although obviously it's much more discontinuous than a traditional filmic sequence. Although there appear to be 36 discrete images of Ethel Scull, there are actually only 17 different photographs of the subject, 17 different photo booth snips. In order to suggest a greater degree of diversity of images and poses, Warhol reversed some of the photographs, manipulated their registration on the canvas, and painted them in contrasting, if not clashing, colors. So the silkscreen, the overall format, very different from either one of these individually or the series of 4 that come in automatically from the photo booth machine. Differently from that, Warhol has placed these in a grid which enforces geometrical order while avoiding any pattern of predictable replication. And I think that the visual differences in Ethel Scull 36 times, they're derived not only from the contrast of color and pose, but also sort of more symbolically from the disconnect between a low photographic technique, that is the automated photo booth in a Times Square penny arcade, and a higher genre of painting, that is the patron portrait from a wealthy collector. The portrait forces its sitter out of her appropriate social space, the living room of her Fifth Avenue residence, and into an unexpected venue where she is entirely unexpected, and even seems to feel that their presence there is something of a shock, or at least a point of interest to the other patrons of the penny arcade. Sorry, I just lost my. But the reason why actually I'm showing you this is because of something that Ethel Scull, and going into such detail about it, is because of something Ethel Scull later said, when actually at the same moment where she recalled this anecdote about going down to the Times Square arcade. And what she said was, quote, "What I liked about it mostly was that it was a portrait of being alive." And I'm very interested in this idea about Ethel Scull being alive in the moment where the portrait was taken. This is a very contemporaneous photograph taken of Ethel Scull with and you can see it's differently organized. Each of the, just to explain, because I think it's important to the logic of this, if you actually see the back of this painting at the Whitney, it is individual canvases that have been attached, stitched together, and the idea is that they could be, and have been, unstitched and reorganized. And so Warhol encouraged Mrs. Scull to rework the organization, the sequencing of the portrait, and even to rework the grid, like how the grid would be organized at will. So anyway, this is a portrait of a photograph, not a portrait, a photograph like a snap, sort of never published in its own moment, of Mrs. Scull in their apartment with Warhol. So you're getting the work, the subject, the sitter of the work, the creator of the work, and between them, the work itself. And one of the things that's of interest, or that I just wanted to propose here before I stop speaking about this, is what does it mean that, at least for me, if this is a portrait of being alive, actually it seems more alive than Mrs. Scull herself does in this photograph. And actually perhaps than Andy Warhol does, who always presented himself as a kind of dead or vacant or cipher, a subject who in certain ways was not there, was always absent or always passive, even though, as we hear in this anecdote, he was in fact much more of an agent than he let on. And so I'm interested in this idea that art can actually be an index of being alive in a way that sometimes the people represented in the art, or the artist, him or herself, is not. That is, that the work of art has not only a life of its own, which of course we know, I mean in terms of where it goes in the world and how it degrades over time and the various people it encounters and narratives it generates, but that it actually activates a sense of aliveness in its own moment, but also in moments, because actually, after all, Mrs. Scull is saying this in retrospect, that it was, and I think there's something that happens when these experiences, or the idea it was that she liked it because it was a portrait of being alive, is put into language, and then later put into print in a book called Andy Warhol's Photography. So I just wanted to propose that in light of a sort of larger argument that I've made about, which Julia kindly mentioned, about the contemporary not being a period in the history of art, or actually even in cultural, in, let's say, late capitalism or politics or culture, but actually being a relational condition, going back to an earlier notion of contemporary as always being contemporary with something. So that it didn't make any sense to say you are contemporary, but to say you are a contemporary of, or you're contemporary with, another person, object, or event. And I'm very interested in this idea of existing alongside as a notion of contemporaneity, and it seems to me that here what we have is actually Mrs. Scull in Warhol's portrait existing alongside herself 35 times. I mean, she's 36 altogether, but being produced as a subject who, in representation, can perhaps embody vivaciousness or aliveness, much, and in the kind of low form of representation that Warhol insists upon, that she would never have volunteered for or herself imagined that would be a record of her own life, or of what it meant to be alive. But through this negotiation between portrait, I'm not going to take 5 minutes, between portrait maker and portrait sitter, an entirely different both temporality and a different record of both the artist's work and the sitter's life is produced. So I'll just say in way of closing that I mentioned already that I'm drawing and on this older, which is actually, it is an older notion of contemporary, as according to the Oxford English Dictionary, belonging to the same time, age, or period, living, existing, or occurring together in time. And one of the things I like about this photograph is it just reminds us that actually artists and patrons, collectors exist, they are contemporary, at least for a time, and they also are contemporary for a time at least with the works that are transacted, or that arise out of transactions between them. Obviously not shown here is Mr. Scull, but at this moment anyway, the Mr. Scull is always sort of implied, actually, and also Ethel Scull is implied in the context of pop art when Mr. Scull is shown, which they often were in Life magazine and elsewhere. So just to sort of say that I would not agree, as some critics have argued, that we are now in a post-contemporary moment of cultural production. Instead, I would say that there is a moving relation between present experience and the historical past, and that there are various ways, and sometimes those ways or those catalysts are works of art, and sometimes it's our memories of works of art, and sometimes it's encounters, other kinds of encounters, both social and phantasmatic, and also encounters not only between people, but between people and objects, and sometimes even between objects and other objects, like when curators reimagine the past by putting, let's say, works of art in conversation that you never thought could say, or never imagined speaking to each other. That is how a sense of being alive, or the contemporary, as an effect of being alive with, or being alive to someone or something else, is produced. And so for this panel, I was just interested in the idea that we could possibly get away from the notion of what is the contemporary, and as the panel, what is the name of the panel? When. So, and I would sort of say the contemporary is now, but the now is not necessarily our now. The now may also be, and I think interestingly has to be, other experiences of the now, like this moment of the now, which is not actually this moment of the photograph, but the moment of the now, which is sort of recorded, and then reworked and very much orchestrated by Warhol, because it's not as though his portrait looks like, this is not what you get when you go into a photo booth. This is totally managed and transformed through Warhol's vision of pop art, and also his vision, I think, of wealthy collectors of his work, and how to, in effect, bring them down or make them interesting as visual subjects. Maybe not down, but bring them out of their homes and into some other space of commerce and culture. So I'm hoping that as we think about dance and other film and video and other kinds of production, we can possibly import this model of the now being not just our now, or the contemporary being not just our contemporary, but being in relation with earlier moments and experiences of being alive. So, thanks.
No. Hi, good afternoon. Just wanted to thank Michael for including me in the encyclopedia, and thank you to Shannon and Mark for inviting me to participate in this really interesting day. So in the time that I have, I'm going to make, I think, what's a small point, although picking up a lot on what Richard raised, I hope, and begin actually with with some quotes from Richard's book, What Was Contemporary in Art. In his afterword, I was struck by the passage where he recounts how Andy Warhol was amused by the claims of younger people to have invented drag. But in doing so, Warhol said, they were making it new again. It was Richard's sense that this is a way into understanding Warhol's work, and by extension, represent a new paradigm for what is contemporary in art. Richard writes, quote, instead of a model of heroic innovation in which each generation must create something radically different from the last, he, Warhol that is, proposes repetition as renewal in the sense of making newly relevant. This notion of repetition as renewal, making newly relevant, could also be a way to think about the contemporary in film and media. Almost uniquely in the history of art, part of the excitement of cinema in the last 100 years was that it was characterized by being something radically new in the world. Forms and genres were being invented in front of people's eyes. With each new film, there was the possibility of seeing images and narrative forms that were never seen before. So if we ask the question, what was contemporary about film in, say, 1960, it would be about this kind of newness. As Susan Sontag wrote about that period, it seemed like there were new, entirely original masterpieces being produced every month. But if we ask the question, what makes film contemporary today, it seems like the age of heroic innovation is, if not over, it's very rare. Today it seems that we have seen every new film or installation somewhere before, or we recognize it as referencing another film or movement from an earlier period. In fact, the value of the work is often measured by its relationship to something earlier. Thinking about contemporary media art and the relationships among mainstream cinema, documentary film, experimental film and video, and the more recent emergence of art world cinema, the question of what is innovation, repetition, and making newly relevant seems like a central dialectic between these practices. What is contemporary in one context may already appear to be historical in another. It is striking to see how, on the one hand, art world artists and curators are rediscovering cinematic forms and technologies already deeply explored by filmmakers decades earlier. The materiality of film objects, multi-screen and sculptural expanded cinemas, storytelling, just as a few examples, which now re-emerge as vanguard in contemporary art museums and galleries. On the other hand, it's extraordinary to see how art world artists are revitalizing contemporary dramatic feature filmmaking. One only has to think about Steve McQueen and 12 Years a Slave, or Shirin Nishat's move to feature filmmaking, and of course Julian Schnabel, just to mention three. And how their visual and narrative approaches that come from contemporary art have revitalized in many ways a commercial narrative cinema, while the feature film industry seems mired in high-tech innovation, CGI, 3D, non-photographic imaging, but at the same time still often repeating old-fashioned and conventional narrative and visual forms. It's ironic that during the last couple of decades, when the commercial film world has been mourning the death of cinema with its digital eulogies for the lost mysteries and magic of cinephilia, one thinks of Scorsese's Hugo, or Méliès in 3D, or the faux silent film The Artist. The art world, at the same time, has finally discovered the possibilities and romance of cinephilia. On the one hand, the technologies of spectatorship have driven commercial cinema from being a mass medium in which the cinema has moved from a social and collective activity, meeting at the movie theater, watching with strangers and friends, toward an increasingly private experience, from the sterile cracker boxes of the multiplex to home video, watching in one's living room, to online streaming, allowing one to binge watch anything at any time, anywhere on their iPhones, iPads, and laptops. The art museums, galleries, concert halls, on the other hand, are turning into movie theaters. Museum galleries are chock-a-block with high-tech multi-screen video installations, low-tech 16mm projections, what you can see here. And filled with rebuilt mutoscopes, zoetropes, and camera obscuras. Then there are blockbuster shows on German expressionist cinema, which is now open now at LACMA, or the films of Stanley Kubrick, or shows on the cinematography of the great Gabriel Figueroa. The last major Pasolini retrospective in New York was held not in the great Cinematheques of New York City, but in the barely darkened galleries of PS1, with Pasolini's gorgeous feature films playing on cheap data projectors, more as an emblem of a virtually extinct artistic vanguardism rather than as an actual experience of the films in the context they were made for. All of these exhibitions seem to be simulating a cinephilia that has passed out of the present. Exhibitions are informative yet nostalgic and seem to express a desire for the energy of the emergence of a new art form that can no longer be found. I was in Shanghai in December and saw the Shanghai Biennale, which seemed to be largely based on cinematic art. It was striking to see room after room of video and film installations, single-screen documentaries shown next to drawings, paintings, and photographs. There were several theaters in the giant museum, which was called the Powerhouse of Art, that were screening ongoing programs of feature-length political and ethnographic documentaries, dramatic and avant-garde films by major filmmakers from all over the world. It was interesting that the newspapers in Shanghai were filled with complaints about how this work didn't have anything to do, couldn't really be understood as art itself. Some of this contemporary media art re-engages the legacy of the modernist avant-garde with its focus on medium specificity and the exploration of an absolute cinema in which the materiality of the medium was foregrounded as a singular experience of film. But at the same time, a lot of this work gives way to the possibilities of a post-medium hybridity that makes them absolutely contemporary. And some of the examples of some of these recent filmic works which return to the apparatus at the moment, just as it's becoming anachronistic. This is a installation called The Distance Between You and Me by Gonzalo Lebrija, using 16 millimeter film and film loops. This is called The Waterfall, a 4-projector 16 millimeter film installation by Raquel Ladensack from 2011. And the ways in which the apparatus itself, which is usually hidden in a projection booth, is actually part of the objects of that. There's also Rodney Graham's torqued chandelier release from 2005, in which he has fabricated a 35 millimeter projector which sits in the middle of the gallery room. And another piece by Graham called Millennial Time Machine, in which he invents builds a camera obscura inside of a early 20th century coach. And this is the image from that. So here we can see these kinds of returns in a very contemporary situation. In other areas, the radical aspiration of a politically engaged and even revolutionary avant-garde of the 20s and the 60s and the 70s, political modernism, that informed much of the radical film theories and practices of the 20th century, from Russian constructivism to third cinema and the politically engaged underground and activist cinemas, are also being made newly relevant in the contemporary context of critical media practices. Contemporary artists continue to explore the possibilities of radical form as radical content, and the promise that through cinema one could ask the most crucial and challenging questions of our time, and that the art form was still capable of answering them. In this context, works by contemporary avant-garde filmmakers are using new digital processes to reanimate photographs and films from the early 20th century, to explore ways in which digitalization can complicate notions of photographic indexicality as historical trace in the relationships between past and present. By reworking such images from the past, it allows unique reflection on earlier moments in the history through the interplay of periodized image technologies, making these works at once early and contemporary. And these images are from a film entitled Razzle Dazzle, The Lost World, by the filmmaker Ken Jacobs from 2007. And here he uses a film strip from a 1903 one-minute short made by the Edison Film Company of children taking an early amusement park ride, and also a series of 19th century stereoscopic photographs dramatizing the horrors of World War I. Razzle Dazzle, The Lost World is a wordless epic history of the US in the years of the 20th century leading up to World War I. Jacobs digs into the footage through magnification, breaking it apart, freezing it, and repeating motion, peeling back the surface of the material to see component elements, photographic grain, and digital pixels. Jacobs explores this footage through the digital medium, and the digital medium through the footage. Razzle Dazzle can be seen as an allegory for the present, in which digital imaging technologies of modern entertainment, such as computer games and movies designed by today's Hollywood directors and graphic artists, have become the digital interfaces for today's push-button bombing and drone warfare. So these are just some of the ways in which he is transforming these. I'll move through this fairly quickly. Beautiful. These early photographs are then transformed Similarly, some of the last works of the late filmmaker Harun Farokhi also was working on digital games and the ways in which cinematic genre returns in the games. And so the Western here, the film noir, the war film. And just to quickly, I have very little time. Other film and video work that renews the radical promise of cinema can be seen in more lateral kinds of works. And I raise the work of Laura Poitras, whose intimate and closely observed political documentaries really came out of her training in avant-garde film, this idea that you could make intimate single-person films and travel to Iraq, or travel to Iraq to document the war, travel to Hong Kong to bring Edward Snowden forward. And then I'm going to have to stop here, but I wanted to leave you with what I think is a very contemporary work by a collective. Can I show a 4-minute thing?
Yeah,
Or
I think we have time.
to do? I want to end, I was going to talk about the emergence of experimental media in the developing world, in Africa, in India, and in the Middle East. And I wanted to end with a very short film. By an anonymous Syrian collective called Abu Nadara. From April 2011 onwards, Abu Nadara, a group of self-taught filmmakers in Damascus, have been producing one short documentary every Friday and launching it on the internet. As they write, Abu Nadara is a nickname for a man with glasses. They say, we chose it based on its use in Arab cities where ordinary people are identified by their professions or the names they are associated with the latter. We also chose this name to sound a rallying cry for the World Republic of Documentary Cinema, one of whose earliest pioneers, Diga Veritov, called himself the man with the camera. So this collective is aligning itself with the history of radical and activist media. And this is a piece that was just made in the last couple of months, and it's called The Day After. And I'll leave you with this.
ما من عندي هطلع هناك ده بعدين اصحابك عيني عليك يا ابو صديق ترى جيت ما احلاك هيك يعني ايش رايك فيه شيل حديدي كلمه شيل حديدي جينا حطينا التسميكه من هوني شيل هي ما بتركض سكر الباب لخوي سكر الباب وترس عليه ما بتركض وينك؟ ناولني ولا بالعكس بعدين تشيل تحت بالعكس ليش؟ نعم لتحت بالمنقل يلا بس حالك ركب بقى حط لعندك بس ركزها هيك من عندك شلونها هيك ما تدخلها كثير ضربتها بس شغلة نص سنتي على الحجر على الباب لو واحد خليها نص سنتي
That's it. So, thank you.
No, it just depends on if I have time. If I have time, I can show them if I don't have time. Good afternoon. First, want to thank Shannon and Lauren and Lindsay and Sarah in the back there for organizing a really stimulating event today, and also to express my gratitude that dance gets to be included in the conversation. So in order to prepare my thoughts for today, I spent the last few weeks polling different people on what they understand contemporary dance to be. And so what I'm going to offer now is indebted to the insights and the shared texts of Jennifer Johnson, Lisa Wymore, Mo Miner, Kate Mattingly, and the grad students in my performance theory class. So the term contemporary in relationship to dance connotes both a temporal designation, it's the dance that's happening now, and a set of aesthetic traits. The problem with the second connotation, defining contemporary dance according to an aesthetic style, is that there is a lot of contention over what that style is, and whether or not it should even be identifiable. The problem with the first connotation, that it's the dance that's happening now, is that if an artist is not deemed stylistically contemporary, the second connotation, then she risks falling outside of the temporal designation too. That is, she might no longer be seen as coeval with her contemporaries. I was rehearsing my thoughts for today with my grad students yesterday, and a few of them observed that, perhaps it's an oversimplification, I don't know, you can all tell me, that in literature or in film, the term contemporary can be exclusively a temporal category, not attached to a coherent aesthetics. In music and in dance, though, in music it's just as I understand it from some of my graduate students, in dance certainly, there seems to be some anxiety over the need to identify specific aesthetic markers under the category contemporary. Perhaps in order to enable a theorization of current work, we want to imagine that it is part of some unifying trend, some consistent logic, or some aesthetic, or political, or cultural, or intellectual imperative that drives it. Certainly, trying to identify recognizable traits can be productive, can tell us something about the era in which we live. On the other hand, what if, after we determine what those stylistic traits are, this necessarily excludes artists whose work does not look like what we have defined? Obviously, there's a racial and ethnic dimension to this problem, to this conflation of a temporal and an aesthetic category. Contemporary dance as an aesthetic genre is dominated by white Euro-American artists. Are artists who don't fit the style then not contemporary, in perhaps Richard Meyer's sense of the word? So here are two examples of dance critics bemoaning the indecipherability of contemporary dance. So in a 2005 article in the New Yorker, dance critic Joan Acatella writes, "Right now, New York's downtown dance shows no engulfing trends, as it did in the 1960s and 70s, conceptualism and politics, or in the 80s and 90s, irony and politics." Or in a dance review by Claudia LaRocco, published in 2011, quote, "For large stretches of To the Ones I Love," a piece that she was reviewing, "it is difficult to get any sense of a mind at work. The movement palette is boilerplate, contemporary/international. Ballet, modern, capoeira, yoga, hip-hop, with all of the various complexities and particularities smoothed out to create one vague patina." Part of the anxiety over what contemporary dance is derives from the fact that it means different things depending on the context of its use. So I'll just outline a few of these different understandings. So Euro-American concert dance, I sort of see this category as one that's sort of like you know it when you see it, if you're sort of in the concert dance circuit, and at the same time it's encompassing enough that it's kind of difficult to define. Sometimes used interchangeably, so the term contemporary dance is sometimes used in the context of Euro-American concert dance, is sometimes used interchangeably with the terms modern, postmodern, experimental, or downtown. It sometimes defines itself against modern and postmodern as both periods and forms. It's sometimes called postmodern. Sometimes the terms contemporary and modern are actually folded together. For example, on a dance studio website, I noted classes in contemporary modern technique. Interestingly, the Martha Graham School is titled, quote, the Martha Graham School of Contemporary Dance. And if you know anything about dance history, you know that Graham is like the almighty mother of modern dance with a capital M. Formally speaking, contemporary dance might include release technique, floor work, contact improv, and/or ballet. It increasingly draws on non-Western forms and street dance forms. It connotes a dancing body that is highly versatile across a variety of skills, or what Susan Foster describes as the, quote, hired body. Compositionally, it might incorporate spoken text or multimedia. It is often cerebral and anti-spectacle, though not always. It's opposed to the dramatic or the excessively expressive, though not always. It is highly formal, but sometimes deliberately pedestrian. In other words, you could argue that it is bounded by certain recognizable aesthetics, while at the same time it's not always limited to them. So recently, my dance colleagues and I in the department have been thinking about changing the title of our dance technique courses. They're currently called Beginning, Intermediate, and Advanced Modern Dance. So recently we had a meeting and we said, you know, we think that maybe this term isn't appropriate for what we're teaching, and we're thinking about changing it to contemporary dance. There was unanimous and uncontentious agreement. But then a couple days later, my colleague Lisa Wymore met with some students who were leaders of the hip-hop groups on campus, and she just mentioned in passing, so just so that you know, we're changing our classes from modern to contemporary, and there was like a great outcry, fairly unanimous outcry. And the reason for that is that their understanding of contemporary didn't describe what we teach. And this reminded us that there is this other context for understanding contemporary dance, and that is the commercial/competitive dance world, which is epitomized by the show So You Think You Can Dance. In that world, contemporary dance is emotive, dramatic, virtuosic, with some technical resemblances to modern, postmodern, and contemporary concert dance. An article that I found last night says that contemporary dance has its origins in ballet and jazz. No mention of modern or postmodern and the periodization and the dance history that comes along with all of that. So So You Think You Can Dance, contemporary dance is distinguished on the show as not hip-hop, jazz, or ballroom. Interestingly, many of the students that Lisa talked to said that it was too feminine. It's certainly, in that world, very normatively gendered and decidedly hetero. Okay, so a third context would be non-Western dance. Of course, contemporary tends to be a necessary qualifier when we refer to Asian, my field, or other non-Western art, because without it, Asian dance is assumed to be traditional. Another way to think about this is that Asian becomes the necessary qualifier for contemporary work that comes from Asia, because contemporary dance is otherwise assumed to be Western. So Asia is yoked to traditional, and contemporary is yoked to Western. And it's difficult for choreographers to be both Asian and contemporary. Often, the category of contemporary Asian dance is really just Western contemporary dance with a few traditional gestures or costume choices that signal Asianness. Or else the work is presumed to be drawing from traditional forms even when it isn't. It's said to resemble Tai Chi, or to balance the forces of yin and yang, or to otherwise exude an air of mysticism, etc. And what of choreographers of traditional non-Western dance forms who are innovating within their tradition without adopting the aesthetics of Western contemporary dance? Put in the context of world dance, contemporary dance as a set of aesthetics can serve to wash over difference, to universalize, and to subsume. As Ananya Chatterjee puts it, quote, all different kinds of bodies can participate on this global stage, though they should speak a familiar language if they want to be marked as contemporary work or, in fact, as choreography at all. So here's the dilemma, and this is my conclusion, or work towards conclusiveness. Contemporary dance evokes both recognition and anxiety across concert, commercial, and world dance stages. If we were to adopt contemporary as exclusively a temporal designation, this opens up the field to allow all forms, each of which carries its own set of aesthetic traits. But this then gives the term no real locus of identification, no way to mark the social, cultural, or political significance of a moment in history. If, however, we localize and delimit contemporary as designating a coherent set of aesthetics, then we relegate so many other forms as not contemporary. And obviously, because of the necessarily temporal valence of this word, that's problematic. I'm not arguing that we can disambiguate the temporal and aesthetic valences of the word contemporary as it relates to dance. Certainly, we could use other terms when we want to emphasize either current era or specific style, synchronous or current, experimental or abstract. I'm merely saying that the double meaning of the term leads us to question the intertwined relationship between artistic style and notions of artistic evolution or development. Sorry.
I'm gonna open, is this on? I have a question for each of you. I thought that those were fantastic presentations and very thought-provoking. And I think all of us were interested in the question of periodization versus the question of style, which came out at different moments in everybody's presentations. So I'm just going to ask you, go down the table and ask one question each, and then we'll open it up for conversation also between us on the panel and also from the audience. So, Richard, I thought, as often as you often do, you have such a bracing, kind of counterintuitive approach to things. So, on this panel about contemporary art, here you show us these things that are also very not of this moment, you know, like even the system of patronage and these analog photo booth photos and everything, you know, her hair, her sunglasses, all of it, so amazingly not of our moment, you know, and I think I just love seeing those images in this context. But I wanted to ask you really about this statement by Ethel Scull of this retrospective designation of this encounter with Warhol and this encounter with her own image as this moment of aliveness, and maybe ask you to, or just ask you to speak a little bit more about the possible frisson of her experiencing a slide between the high and the low. So it wasn't just that she was going to a kind of pop cultural place to have her image taken. It was also knowing that that was under the management of this artist and that it would be elevated. So that there was there's some kind of conversion operation that's being transacted there, that perhaps the aliveness is really part of almost that transgression where the high and the low interpenetrate, I guess. And so I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about that. Jeffrey, I was really struck by the quote, the Sontag quote from the 60s, where she talks about the brand new masterpiece every month. And I thought, wow, for her that sounds really fast, you know, and for us, this acceleration has been so intense that pace sounds really glacial now, you know? I mean, and then you show us a Syrian collective that uploads something every week, and even that seems kind of like, well, what are they waiting on? You know, there's thousands of things being uploaded to YouTube every minute, and I just would love to hear you speak a little bit more precisely about the question of acceleration, I guess, or kind of quickening that I feel like attends a lot of new media technology, and the institutionalization of film and video practices. And Leslie Sansan, what a wonderful and clear breaking out of the problem of the modern and the contemporary in dance. I've actually been wanting, I kind of have needed that in my world for a long time, so clarifying. And I thought your word anxiety was just exactly perfect, and that's precisely, I think, what we're all speaking to, we're speaking around in some way or another. And I wonder if you might speculate about what it means when a discipline like dance, which has not only an institutional life, but also an academic life, when in some ways it suddenly is confronted with a mass cultural terminology that where you have to shift your own thinking about what you think is happening. So I thought it was so telling that the students on campus are saying, you can't tell us what you think contemporary is. We have a different definition that's coming from a different space, and actually how to negotiate those different spheres. So hopefully these are productive, maybe we can just...
Sure. I just wanted to, is it on? I wanted to just read the quote because I feel like maybe I slightly fumbled it. And what Ethel Skull says is, what I liked about it mostly was that it was a portrait of being alive. And I think this is important because it's in the past tense, but she's also talking about the finished portrait by Warhol, not about the photo booth strips, and not about the experience of going down to the arcade, all of those of which, of course, are folded into, her memory of that is folded into, I think, when she looks at the final portrait. But so is her home, her relationship with her husband who paid for it. I should also say that the skulls, Tom Wolfe had written a very sardonic article about the skulls for the New Yorker, I believe, about basically the way in which they were new money Jews and they had no taste, and that there was this whole new crop of collectors, unlike the sort of old money collectors of non-contemporary art, of old masters or something, or even of Impressionism. There were these new, very crass, like taxi fleet owning Jewish, recently arrived arriviste, who were drawn to pop art particularly because it was so accessible, and because actually their own world of commerce and entrepreneurialism was, and so I think that that's very interesting in terms of the way money, all the coins, and also just the passage from Upper Fifth Avenue to Times Square, and from what she expects as a now wealthy woman, someone who married, into new wealth, expects of a famous artist, even though that famous artist is himself the child of working class immigrants who has his own very complicated views both of commerce and of class. So, but just to get back to your question, which was about the being...
low and the high.
Yeah. And I think that Warhol understood, I think, in ways that weren't really, that I think are much more prevalent and maybe even now banal in our culture, that actually, for example, so you think you can dance, that high culture needs and wants low, that it isn't actually this antipathy or this contempt only, that there is also this incredible desire for actually contact with these other zones of the culture, so long as in some way that contact is then elevated and transformed into high art at the end of it. So like Ethel Skull wouldn't have been happy if Warhol just handed her those 100 photo booth strips and was like, or made a collage of them. They had to be made into something on canvas, paint on canvas, that could hang in their very, fancy apartment as art. And Warhol had to already be designated as an important contemporary artist, although that word wasn't so highly charged in that moment as it is now for us. So I just think that that's interesting in relation also this is kind of throwing the ball down the court. But in terms of Jeffrey's, I was really interested in what you were saying about the Pasolini retrospective at PS1, because I was recently reading this book by Douglas Crimp called Our Kind of Movie, which is a great book. However, and I've had this fight, or this conversation with Douglas in person as well, not in print, but Douglas is such an esthete, and he's so insistent about the right way to see Warhol films, which is to make, well now I guess they're somewhat more available, but for him it was to go to MoMA and sit in the screening room and see the actual film, see it on film. And he was horrified by people watching it, the CD conversions, much less watching parts of it on YouTube. And to me, one of the problems with this, and I totally take your point about the bastardization of Pasolini's achievement, which is a historically and technologically specific one. However, our contemporary moment is also one of new kinds of technology and new access to the art historical and the cinematic and the choreographic past. And I think that if we stick to this position, which is Crimp's position, that we have to experience these works in the ways in which they were meant to be experienced in their own moment, then we become these sort of nostalgists, is that a word? We're trafficking in nostalgia, and we're maybe not really actually confronting, which I think in many ways, of course, we don't want it. Who wants to confront, in certain ways, our contemporary moment? I mean, in terms of its accelerated pace and bastardization of history and flattening of art. But nevertheless, that is the way in which these things circulate, and we can't simply close ourselves off from it. Not that you were suggesting we do, but I think it's a very intractable problem. Intractable problem for, especially for scholars and historians who really love these artifacts.
Should I respond?
Whatever, yeah.
Respond to that? I mean, I agree, and I'm all for accessibility. On the other hand, if you believe in, that the medium is the message, or that it's an important part of it, then not to have access to seeing that often just gives the kind of veneer of an experience that to me seems much more about nostalgia than the actual sort of getting inside of the work itself, which may open something up. I mean, this is something, when you're teaching this kind of work, do you show the students, do you let them watch it on their laptop, or do you watch it particularly demanding work? And what's a turnoff on the laptop is often, an exciting experience on the large screen. So I guess I would argue that these forms still need to be accessible, in their form.
But I mean, can I just respond briefly? And this is going actually forward to Sansan's, one of the things that Sansan said, which is, at least with Warhol's films, I mean, the conditions under which they were shown are not these pristine MoMA viewing room conditions. I mean, people were doing drugs, people were walking in and out of the factory, there was sometimes, music and dance and other stuff going on, and I think this idea that I don't know about Pasolini's films, but I would imagine there might be also a somewhat more variegated history of reception than kind of what you're imagining would be the sort of laboratory or clinic, the appropriate. Well, I don't know, though. I don't know the history of Pasolini's films, but at least with Warhol, who's by no means representative of the avant-garde, I think that there's a real question also about drugs. I mean, in other words, are we creating a kind of context for viewing, which actually didn't exist historically? And I think that this is just interesting in terms of your quote of John Acacella saying, well, in the 60s and 70s, it was politics and conceptualism, and then the 80s and 90s it was politics plus irony. And I'm sure that in the 60s and 70s, no one was saying, oh, it's so clear that our moment is what was it? Conceptualism plus politics. And then in the 80s and 90s, people said, in other words, this is retroactive flattening of what was contemporary. And I just wanted to hear more about that, because it seems so easy retroactively, and art history constantly does this. It flattens all these different styles that coexist in a particular historical moment into one dominant style, as though that's the only thing that matters to history. So I thought
No, that's for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I was looking in preparation for this today. I was looking around, and I just put in a search term contemporary dance, and I encountered this book, and I started reading a review of the book, and it kept talking about all the heavy hitter postmoderns. Steve Paxton, Merce Cunningham, Trisha Brown, Alan Kepler, all the 1960s and 70s postmoderns. And the book was called Contemporary Dance or something like that, and they kept using the word contemporary. But of course, it was the temporal designation of contemporary, meaning, with, contemporaneous with. And certainly many of the postmoderns never called themselves postmodern. So, yeah.
Much less contemporary.
Much less, who knows what they call themselves. But they certainly were working in reaction to the moderns.
Right.
But they might have thought of themselves as contemporary in terms of period.
Right.
But not in terms of the style. I can go to Julia's question. Yeah, I mean, certainly I think we could argue that one of the hallmarks of contemporary dance as an aesthetic style, if there is one, is an incorporation of the high and the low, of popular dance forms, of street dance forms, of non-Western dance forms. And so in some respects, that it certainly is something to think about in terms of what we teach when we call it contemporary dance, including hip hop. What does that mean in terms of actually changing the title of the course from modern dance to contemporary dance? Or not doing it because commercial dance thinks of contemporary in different ways? I don't think that we would, it's still an open question. I mean, Lisa and I both kind of looked at each other and shrugged our shoulders. It's feeling less and less like modern dance is an appropriate term for what we do. And hopefully contemporary dances can be capacious enough that it could, we don't teach the commercial version of contemporary dance, and that's what the students were saying. Like, you don't teach that, and we don't want that.
Do you teach hip hop? I'm just
We
curious.
don't. We don't offer hip hop. We offer it in summer sometimes when we can. Yeah, because it's for revenue. The history of our dance department is that it really comes out of a strong tradition of straight up Martha Graham technique. And so it made sense that we were teaching modern technique, and now it makes sense that we're teaching contemporary technique from the perspective of high art, concert, dance, contemporary.
I will say there is hip hop everywhere on this campus.
Yes.
You may not be teaching, and also I think if you decide to, do whatever you want, obviously with your own curriculum, but it seems to me that if you start teaching the same classes, but with the title of contemporary, the students will get that they'll understand that.
And hopefully they'll
There's a
learn
multiplicity
the
of that term,
history
exactly.
of that term.
Right. So maybe we should open it to the audience for questions. I don't know if there's someone, maybe Lauren can wield the microphone.
Thank you for an amazing panel. I have a lot of questions, but I'll ask one that I didn't expect to ask, which was that I actually didn't expect the When is Contemporary panel to end up talking about class as much as it did. And so I was just interested in that next to the way we opened the symposium with Grant talking about Schiller and talking about how the interface across classes, whatever the categories that are the sensuousness associated with lower orders, etc., are part and parcel of the constitution of aesthetics. So I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts or odd connections about that, because it's definitely an unexpected connection for me today.
Unfortunately, I missed Grant's. Is he still here? Oh, right. So, I don't know, I'm not gonna ask you to rehearse it, because you said it already, and I missed that contemporary moment here, at least, but I was alive, but I wasn't here. But I will say just about class, and so this doesn't really remember Grant's contribution about Schiller, but I will say, I just in terms of my case study, I do think that you had mentioned downtown. At one point you had mentioned downtown as an alternative, I believe, to contemporary or experimental. And I do actually think that the story Mrs. Skull, Ethel Skull, tells, who just recently died actually, so the portrait is now, I think, both really importantly about her being alive in a different way and about her passing into historicity, or onto the historical horizon. But her husband and I think one of them was from Brooklyn and one of them was raised in Brooklyn, one was raised on the Lower East Side. So going from uptown, Warhol forcing her into this cab and going down to Times Square, which is Midtown, but still toward downtown, and into the Penny Arcade, which would have been an entertainment available to working class Jews or working class anybody at that moment, I think is really interesting in terms of their ascent. They're thinking of what it meant to be contemporary art collectors as having money and having visibility in the magazines, and also figuring out that the most important new artists were Warhol and Lichtenstein and Wesselman, all the people they collected. But for Warhol, actually I think understanding that what might be a more interesting representation of her subjectivity, or what it meant for her to be alive, was actually something that forced her out of that newly arrived zone and back. Again, I'm pushing it a little bit, but sort of traveling, as it were, toward downtown, or toward a sort of non-elevated, and in their case, as a Jewish immigrant, outer borough or Lower East Side past. And I think that that's just very important, that this notion of downtown, which of course doesn't necessarily need to be, but I think downtown usually is opposed to uptown, and that's usually what we think of as kind of wealth and established conventions, not only of class, but I think also of aesthetics. So that was the only thing I could think of in relation to that.
Well, I think too that when we talk about periodizing the contemporary, we are necessarily thinking about questions of value and worth and taste, institutionalization, etc., which are imbricated in issues of class. And even the very term art itself, like the term craft or like the term participation, as we've been saying, is so structured around these ostensible opposites. And one of them, for craft and for art, is always triangulating itself against work. You know, what are we doing? We're doing art. That's not work. You know, that's the leisure space. What are we doing? Oh, it's craft. It's not work. And I think these are, and hence I think these categories of class are deeply, deeply important to consider. And for me, it's really exciting that it's been an unexpected through line, for sure. I mean, and then of course, craft also highly gendered, at least in the context of the global north. It ranges obviously a lot over time and based on region and very raced. So I think in some ways the questions that have percolated about privilege and about visibility, you know, make sense that they would be kind of surfacing here as well.
I suppose a response would be in relation to film and other popular cultures is, you know, the question of, you know, what is truly popular culture? So is mass media, corporately produced media that, you know, people from all walks of life see, is that really popular media? The idea of experimental or counter cinemas of all kind, which, you know, emerge often from grassroots communities, from the underground, from a whole range of communities that are disempowered and so on, in which new forms have to be invented in order to represent their conditions and realities. But which may not find, you know, a mass audience. Is that truly, you know, popular or democratic culture? And that's partly why I wanted to end with this, you know, the Syrian collective, who very much identify with the, you know, the history and tradition of kind of grassroots and do-it-yourself media, and this idea that even in the midst of a crisis, you know, like the Syrian civil war, that one could continue to make images of daily life. So I think that that question, particularly for film and media, about, you know, where the popular is pretty complex.
I really enjoyed your presentation and that sense of aliveness and how much comes out of that in terms of like maybe what I would think a framework to understanding certain types of art. I can especially see how it would connect to relational practices. But this is more a contribution than a question, but it reminded me of something I read recently, which I thought was really interesting. I've been following the work of Michael Lasher for some time, and I had read a lot about his work in the Claire Copley Gallery in LA, and how the wall that he had asked to be removed between the office space and the exhibition space was sort of a statement on the partition of art and business and how those two sort of didn't connect. But in Kirsi Peltomaki's book, Situation Aesthetics, she beautifully unraveled how the gallerist Claire Copley had reported at the end of that installation, or we should say de-installation, a month later, how she felt so vulnerable to the view, to the people coming into the gallery, and how her whole experience of being in the space and being constantly under people's sight was for her transformative, and though she reported a very prevalent discomfort, she also, it seemed, became very alive through the process.
Is it okay if I know it wasn't a question, but I have something I want to say in response. But it's going to embarrass Julia. It might embarrass Julia, I don't know. But I wanted to say in terms of this idea of vulnerability as an index or a kind of trace of being alive, which might not... It's not that bad. It's okay. I've already published it in Art Forum, so... but like about 5, maybe 8 years ago, we had this conversation called Contemporary Conversations, a public dialogue with 4 different critics and curators and artists, Barbara Kruger, anyway, and Julia was one of the moderators, and after we had the public conversation the next morning, we went to a bar with the students, we just had bagels, and anyway, but to get off campus, and we continued the conversation with the graduate students off campus, and then we had, one of the graduate students was a curator at this gallery, which was right down the street from the block, the street from the bar. So we all went to that show, and it was, what's the name of the artist? It's this Wali Beshti, who had done this piece where he breaks up, he sends things through the mails that are glass, that are purposely broken, and FedEx boxes, and then he exhibits the broken glass and the FedEx. But he had made in this particular installation, the entire floor of the gallery was broken glass, and mirrored glass, and as you walked on it was all mirrored, that's important. And as you walk on it, the glass it breaks further, it shatters further. So I had issues because I was worried about my weight, and I was just like, am I going to break more glass? But there were 3 women, including Julia, who I noticed as soon as we walked in were like all the way in the corner of the room and putting their hands like between their legs. I mean, putting their skirts, like pulling their skirts down. Maybe that's the way to say it. And so I said, like, I actually said in front of the whole, what is going on? And they said, no one warned us, we didn't know there was going to be a mirrored floor, and we're all wearing skirts. And I just thought that was really, really interesting, and when I wrote about that, and that was this moment of total physical and gender.
Luckily they cut me out of the photograph.
I know they cut. So I had to take the photograph. Anyway, and Art Forum cut Julia out because she's a contributor to Art Forum. So they didn't want to show her vulnerable, which maybe is its own index of the contemporary. But they showed the 2 graduate students. It wasn't anyway. But I think that what I wrote is that I feel like someone in the art world is always that woman or those women in the skirt. Like, in other words, I feel like often someone is made to feel uncomfortable or vulnerable. Someone is made to feel ignorant or dumb or excluded, not always so literally, exposed. But and I think that often it's those moments. Perhaps they're moments where you feel alive, but couldn't there be some other way where we have that, like, for example, Ethel Skulls, where we have an experience of being alive to art that isn't. I mean, it does the most heightened experience we have to have, which I think often is this one of actually feeling bad, like, in some way or other. And I think it's most often, at least for me, it's about a lack of comprehension or just feeling like, oh, I'm not part of this cognoscenti, or part of this sort of world that for whom this is so meaningful. And I don't really even know if I want to be, and therefore why am I in this gallery? Why am I spending my life writing about art? And it could spiral out from there. So, sorry, that was a very long, but I think this issue of Claire Copley's vulnerability, that there's a really interesting history perhaps to be written about viewership, not the artist's vulnerability, but about and not necessarily the subjects or the sitters, but other people, the critics, the gallery goers, the gallery assistants, the employees, that there's a lot of people who are exposed to a work of art who aren't really accounted for by art history or art criticism.
This is going to pick up on that a little bit in terms of spiraling out of control, but it's a question for Sansan, and it's this negotiating different spheres, that in your talk I hear you mentioning this label contemporary in realms of performance and pedagogy and criticism and commercial cultures. And what I think is especially great about what you brought up with Joan Acachella is that's the piece that Terry O'Connor responded to with a scathing criticism of her use of this word contemporary. But in each of these realms, certain people have ways of benefiting from this use of the label, and also, it's used against them in ways. So I'm just thinking about the institutional relations between contemporary in performance, contemporary in pedagogy, contemporary in criticism, and then contemporary in commercial cultures. And maybe since pedagogy might be what you're closest to here, especially with this move from modern dance, what UC Berkeley used to promote and preserve, to contemporary, like what do you have to benefit, or what would that serve as a department?
Oh, sorry. I think in terms of what do we have to benefit, it's so much more of a capacious and encompassing term, and it's so much more appropriate to what we teach. Why not dance technique? Because that's
dance class.
the beginning dance.
Yeah.
Why
does it have a label?
Well, yeah. Why does it have a label? And could it be something other than contemporary that isn't that designates it as having certain aesthetic coherence without it being connected to a temporal designation? Yes, that would be lovely if such a thing existed, and I guess modern came to mean that because when we say modern, we know aesthetically exactly what that means in dance, pretty much exactly. Whereas with contemporary, I think it's still an open question. But the benefit of moving from modern dance technique to contemporary dance technique is that it opens up the possibility for so much more kinds of work and kinds of styles that we could teach.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
Do you see a relationship between performance as contemporary, pedagogy as contemporary?
Yeah, maybe this isn't what your question is. The way I translated it in my mind is that I think there is an aesthetic difference between contemporary choreography and contemporary technique.
You think there is a link?
I think there's a link, but I think there's a distinction. Like, I think that there are traits that we could identify as contemporary choreography, like the compositional strategies and conventions that happen on a stage that we would identify as contemporary. And then I think that there are technical, in terms of vocabulary and the way that the body moves and the skills that it has and the energetic impetuses and the way it uses space and the way it uses bones and muscles and so forth that have a specificity to them. Yeah.
My question is for Sasa as well. First of all, I think what's interesting about the idea of contemporaries is the overarching theme, because you're still going to be teaching modern dance technique, and it is, in fact, its own technique, just as, or I look at it that way from my background in it. So one of the questions I had for you was if, right now what I'm seeing on the ground level on the street, because I ended up being a lead choreographer for a Showgirls review, and from a modern dance background. And I'm fascinated by the fact that this particular generation is responding to and paying for and really having a great time with vaudeville again. Vaudeville's back, and I would never have expected that as a contemporary dance and performance field again. So I wanted to see what you thought about that.
So I think I would argue that what we teach in our department isn't modern technique. It's contemporary, whatever that means. It's release technique, it's floor work, it's contact improvisation, it's not contractions and a link to a notion of the natural body and its natural expressivity. So it's not modern dance, it's actually contemporary. And I love that you bring up the idea of vaudeville, because in some ways I think that what we're trying to think about in terms of what contemporary technique is, or what the versatile so-called higher body, although that has its problems, includes is a range of different styles, all of which are acceptable. Hip-hop, vaudeville, neo-burlesque, yoga, tai chi, whatever, that all of those things can be incorporated into a kind of sense of kinesthetic understanding of the body. So, yeah.
I have a question about that though, because I think maybe slightly differently, or coming from a different place from Julia, saying, well, they'll get it, that contemporary means all these things. I actually think the students were saying something really important to you when they said, we don't agree that this is contemporary, what you're doing. And in the sense that I think partially what the contemporary, if we take it seriously, is about being alive. There's going to be generational differences, but also insights. I mean, when Alfred Barr in 1927 taught what is supposed to have been the first, what we would now call contemporary art history class, he designated all the students in the class as faculty, which he didn't do when he taught Baroque art or Renaissance art, or even 19th century art specifically. And he did that because he felt like they were and they were going to become experts as much as he was in what was going on right now, and he assigned them somebody worked on architecture, someone worked on theater, someone worked on magazine, like graphic design. But I think that this idea that maybe the students actually know what contemporary is at least as well as their professors, since so much of contemporary culture is geared toward a more youthful, unfortunately, for better or worse, audience than we represent. I think that actually it would be helpful to talk more as a faculty or with the students or without them about, well, what is it that they feel contemporary represents that isn't part of our curriculum, and if it isn't, how do we signal that what that is important too, and not kind of colonize the contemporary as a kind of elevated sort of postmodern practice.
I mean, I completely agree with you, which is why we're at this impasse, because they don't want their understanding contemporary to be taught in our department. Right. They are more interested in a high art notion of what they would call modern and we would call contemporary. And so it's not really necessarily a generational gap, it's a high art, low art divide, right? It's a low art, so-called low art commercial notion of what contemporary is versus a high art concert dance notion of what contemporary is. And
but isn't that partially a generational divide, or at least a pedagogical one, between the professoriate and students
Yeah.
who might be much more open to what's going on in mass culture?
I guess, although there's plenty of faculty in other places that are private studios, not university institutions, and that's class 2, that teach a commercial understanding of contemporary. So it's not like, yeah. But anyway, yes, we are at an impasse because we don't know what to do with. We want to embrace an understanding that the term means lots of different things, and we don't want to foreclose that. So yeah, we really are at an impasse.
I was just going to say you can look at it the other way around, which is that because of commercial culture, young people are only exposed to commercial dance, and coming to the university is a way of finding out another notion of what the contemporary is. And I think that that's one of the real issues that we face teaching contemporary art in this culture now. So
I just worry about us sort of imagining that we're somehow outside the commercial, that what we're doing is not commercial dance or not commercial art, when, as Andy Warhol would say, every artist is a commercial artist. Right. Actually also the university is obviously engaged in it. I don't need to say that at UC Berkeley, but it's engaged in its own economic and commercial exchanges and challenges. So I don't know, I just think that what you're talking about seems to me slightly avant-gardiste. Like what we do is this, it's not this commercial, and maybe that is what you do. But I would imagine what you do is also part of the avant-garde is an engagement with these other realms.
Right.
I mean,
Audience?
I realized that Greg did this last, so I figured I know I wanted to be the moderator. I was charged with being.
Hi, I haven't totally worked this out, but it seemed important to maybe put it in now rather than later, so I'm hoping you'll help me out a bit. I guess I was thinking about, in relation to this question, what Sansan laid out of, okay, let's talk about the now, the temporal, right, the stylistic, and then I was thinking, what happens if we run that up against what Richard is proposing, which is really the between, the relational condition, right? Because I think it's really important to say, if we look at something like So You Think You Can Dance, we're also talking about dance for camera. Right, we're talking about a fundamentally different relational condition of how that's worked out versus, say, the somatic work we try to do in a studio. And so I guess then I started wondering if somehow what you were laying out is some of the problems when we break dance, contemporary dance down by style, right? The Euro-American concert, the commercial competitive, and then also the question of then what happens to work from, say, that's not aligned with the notion of contemporary from the global north. I was wondering if adding that third category of the relational, the two, could give us a different way of dividing that.
Yeah, I totally love that because it's also like we can think about the a lot of different relationships, right? So the relationship between the dancer, choreographer, and the audience is really different in commercial dance than it might be in a concert dance stage. And when Julia, I totally take your point about the question of work and how that drops out, and I was thinking about that in terms of like, you know, who's the audience who's watching So You Think You Dance, or what's the so-called usefulness, to go back to the other panel from earlier, of competition / commercial contemporary dance versus dance that happens on a concert stage. And I was reminded of Jerome Bell, who would certainly call himself and self-identify as a contemporary choreographer, saying that, well, it's the audience's, it's the bargain they make that they don't know what they're going to see when they buy a ticket to my show, right? Which is a very privileged thing to say. So I'm not really answering your question, but certainly I think thinking about relationality in lots of different partners in that set of relationships is really important.
I have a question on en route to Annika, which is, or not a question, but a comment, I guess, about the formulation of this panel, which for me is so exciting in that Richard and I, who are in the same field, which is largely known as contemporary art, have been subject to a lot of very airless conversations about the definitions of the contemporary, and it really does, so much of it has been about these starting points and these dates, and the stakes have felt, or for me at least, extremely trivial, you know, so who cares, 1985 versus 89, what are we really talking about? And I think having this more interdisciplinary conversation really reminds us that there's purchase here, that the categories have meaning outside of, you know, our little hothouse. So I'm just grateful, I guess, to Shannon, who's not here, but for the record, for the organization of this constellation.
Thanks for a compelling and energizing panel. My question's about the Abu Nadara clip, and it was a great choice, partly because the politics of Abu Nadara is a kind of insistence on existing alongside and life that will persist beyond the regime. So the aesthetic, so they cite Vertov, but the actual casualness of the footage that you describe is a existence of a subjectivity that's not a regime subjectivity, and the project began before the revolution. So we have this kind of persistence of personal life that was the politics beforehand and then remains so in that resistance discourse through cinema, which we could, you know, which is just sort of the poetics of it as well. When you introduced it, of course, you were tripped up by the socioeconomic categories we all inherit, which is developing economies and emerging cinema. So I just wanted to push back and ask exactly what brings this film practice in line with the other contemporary practices that you were highlighting. Is it a kind of media ecology where we have all of these past moments that the cinema maker claims? Or is it, you know, just a rarefied aesthetic that we can recognize, or, you know, how you see it aligning with the gallery practices that you also highlighted?
First, in relation to their sort of desire to be connected with Vertov, I think there's something about the idea of Vertov's idea of the kino eye and the way in which one is collecting the events and activities of the everyday as a kind of way of being alive. And so in that sense, I think they're linking to that. Abu Nadara seems, at least to my knowledge, really circulates within the art world. Their work is being shown in those contexts. They just won a prize at the New School. So in that sense, they're not being shown in other kinds of contexts, so that they're already linked to this this world. And one of the things that I was trying to raise was the way in which, you know, this kind of media, independent, underground, radical media, at this point seems to have its place in the art world. I mean, it connects in some ways to Sharon's work as well. I mean, one could ask, well, you know, why is your work circulate largely in the art world as opposed to other academic, activists or other kinds of contexts? So the art world has become a place in which this kind of work can exist and circulate, I suppose.
Maybe one more question if there's one. Okay, so I wanted to, I guess Ed had some comments from Shannon who had to leave.
Yes, just briefly. Shannon had to leave to go see her daughter perform, but she asked me on her behalf to thank Lauren, Sarah, and the ARC students for organizing this event. And that was her final parting words. So.
We won't take a break, but go right to Michael for his concluding thoughts. So thank you also to Richard, Sansan, and Jeffrey.
Feel alive at the Wall of Veshti. I felt very angry. I felt rageful, and I felt surveyed and misunderstood.
But rage can be a feeling of aliveness, no?
I think it was much more negative. Far more negative.
I have to remind people again that if you need to use the elevator to leave the building, you'll have to do so in the next few minutes before the elevators shut off at 5 p.m. So sorry about that, but I do need to remind you about that. Okay, so we're now going to move directly to Michael's remarks. Michael? Oh, I'm sorry. Did you hear me?
Yes.
But he does a lot of, he's had.
I just can speak into this.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. I don't think I quite appreciated that this said symposium wrap-up exactly. I'm not sure. Is this on?
I don't think it's on.
Easier to hold.
No, it's not on.
It says it is. Now it is. Yes, I didn't quite appreciate that on the program it said symposium wrap-up. I'm not sure exactly how I could do that. But it goes to a point about the temporality of contemporary art that I'd like to get back to in a minute, about the notion of simultaneity. If I were to wrap up so soon after things have unfolded, it would be virtually simultaneous with the unfolding, and so that I could just play back very fast what happened earlier today or something. It would be that intelligible, which is to say unintelligible. Let me give a little bit of information, and then just raise some questions or make some points maybe, and we can have maybe some others could ask some questions that they needed time to formulate. First is about the Transdisciplinary Aesthetics Foundation, which is one of the sponsors of this symposium. it grew out of the encyclopedia because I was looking for some way to continue this project, and not with the idea of, building a third edition in the future, because I'm not, don't have that intention. But to find some kind of, quasi-institutional but not quite institutional basis for continuing the encyclopedia, because it emerged because there was a renewed interest in aesthetics. I mean, in 1998, I used to say that there were only two problems with doing the Encyclopedia of Aesthetics, and that was the notion of encyclopedia and the notion of aesthetics. Because everybody was sort of anti-clerical about thinking about an encyclopedia as if it were this compendium that included all of knowledge and would be complete and all this sort of thing. And obviously that's an absurd notion. It's not even the historical notion of the encyclopedia. I mean, I don't quite know where that came from, and people were also not interested in aesthetics. It was sort of, the first edition came out in '98. We started in '92, so in that period it was, looking back now, the sort of height, but also the beginning of the decline of the anti-aesthetic. So what was interesting though is that a lot of the people who were resisting both the encyclopedic nature of the encyclopedia and the focus on aesthetics ended up contributing to the encyclopedia in various ways, because we said, well, look, we want the questioning of aesthetics, the name of this sort of symposium, to be part of that history. Then it'll be clear that we don't have that notion of encyclopedia in mind. We have some notion of aesthetics. It's the simultaneous, heterogeneous notions of what aesthetics has meant in the past and what it can mean in the present, and that's what we were looking to do. So many of those people became part of the encyclopedia. And this time around, there was less of that resistance to encyclopedia. People, I think, understand that that's not what it needs to mean, that sort of comprehensive, exclusive, closed notion of encyclopedia. There was much more like Eco's idea of an open work, an encyclopedia as an equivalent, a discursive equivalent of an open work of art. And people were more open to aesthetics. I mean, it just seemed to emerge, or be emerging in all sorts of places, including places where the anti-aesthetic had been very strong, say in art history or art criticism, contemporary, whatever that is exactly. And then there were also new fields like aesthetic computing. Although their predecessors to it, as we heard in that panel, it didn't exist as in the 90s as such. Or neuroaesthetics, or geoaesthetics, or disability aesthetics. I mean, these are either new fields that had turned to their aesthetic dimension in some sense. And so that interest in aesthetics is what generated the second edition. So it was a quite different experience to do the encyclopedia the second time. It was the challenge. The first time made it an intellectual challenge. It made it in a strange way worth doing to try to combat these notions of aesthetic encyclopedia. In this case, it was almost too easy. I mean, there was just, the resistance wasn't there. And sometimes you need that resistance to have something. So we realized that there was just a lot of senses of what aesthetics could mean. They're not all compatible. They overlap in various kinds of ways and so on. And the encyclopedia can only reflect some aspect or some range of that complex picture. So we're trying to think of some way of continuing this, not necessarily, as I say, by doing, one option might have been to do this online and then have it continuously revised. To my mind, that's more like the wrong idea of encyclopedia than the right idea enabled by digital means. I mean, the idea that you could constantly revise it and it would be like running after that comprehensive notion of the encyclopedia. This is meant to be, as was the first edition, a symptom, a reflection, an index, whatever, of its time, and to be out of time as soon as the print was dry on encyclopedia. It's sad but true. It's actually, and that's all, this is already out of date. It was published just in August. But that's important. It's an important part of the encyclopedia that it is of that time. So then the question is how to continue that. So we established a transdisciplinary aesthetics foundation with initially with some money from the encyclopedia itself, and then we've attracted some private money, and we will do a symposium of this sort. We did one in New York as part of the launch party. It was also called Questioning Aesthetics. It had, over 2 days, it had 6 panels, and they were meant to reflect the scope of the encyclopedia, what was new about it, things that you might not have expected to find in an encyclopedia of aesthetics. This version has 3 questions. Going forward, we may get more, have singular questions. So for example, the next one is November 6th and 7th at CalArt, and the question there, anticipated in many of the discussions here, is when is art political? Trying to understand. So it'll be 2-day symposium focused simply on that question, and then there will be a further one at RISD next spring, where the issue of critical design will be a central part of it, and then there are a number of others in the works, and how far this goes depends on the funding, of course. They're all collaborative events, so in each case we'll see how that works. So that's just to give you a little bit of sense of what that is, and I'll be hoping to having discussions with any and all of you about what you might see that foundation doing, or what you might see this sort of symposium, Questioning Aesthetics. With its title is Questioning Aesthetics, it sort of includes that anti-aesthetic moment. I'm not thinking that we're over that and shouldn't be. That's the kind of skepticism about aesthetics, where aesthetics is the object of critique, is an important part of aesthetics as it continues, but now aesthetics is also part of is in a sense the subject of some of these critiques going forward. So then the notion of aesthetics is critical thinking about art, culture, and nature, or the longer version of the critical thinking about the beliefs, principles, presuppositions, aims, purposes, ambitions, etc., of art, culture, and nature. And when that was the sort of, not really definition, but the characterization or the, of aesthetics for the first encyclopedia, it emerged out of conversations with people when they said, I don't do aesthetics, why did you ask me to do this? And I said, well, what is it that you don't do when you don't do aesthetics? And they describe it, and I said, well, okay, then what is it you do when you don't do aesthetics, and what do you call that? And there are all sorts of names for it, and I think, in a sense, people have come around to say, well, aesthetics can be that kind of critical reflection. And so when I answered that question, what aesthetics is, one day in the course of the first edition, I said critical thinking, art, culture, and nature. And whoever was at the other end of the conversation, in person or on the phone online, I don't remember, they didn't say no, or they just said, okay, I'll write. And I kept repeating it, and nobody ever asked me what I meant. So when we started this one, I had said it, there were almost 1,000 people involved with this. And I don't know how many times I've said aesthetics is critical thinking. Nobody's ever asked me what I mean by that, or what is meant by that exactly, which is strikingly uncritical sense of it. But I take it that people don't ask, however uncritical it might be, because they identify with, in some way, it's capturing something outside of philosophy, the sense of aesthetics that's not simply part of philosophy, which is what people imagine that it is. So the analogy I have is that aesthetics has left philosophy in the way that art left the museum decades or whatever ago, and that art thrived very well, thank you, outside of the museum. The museum, successfully or not, has adjusted to art being outside its own walls and so on. In fact, museums may have prospered from art having left its walls and so on. That hasn't happened in philosophy vis-a-vis aesthetics. It's a shrinking field within philosophy, as philosophy itself is a shrinking field, but aesthetics is very much alive. It's very ripe, it's very prominent in many other areas. Well, almost too many areas. So there's something called ubiquitous computing. There's kind of ubiquitous aesthetics. Lev Manovich says that, I'm talking about something like aesthetic computing, that software is our interface to the world. And I would say, well, that means that aesthetics is necessary in analyzing that interface. That's where the critical thinking about art, culture, and nature, or that part of that interface comes into the picture. But then it seems too amorphous what aesthetics is exactly. If it is truly everywhere, maybe that's part of the provocation that Whitney raised this morning in saying that both that everybody is now an esthetician, which means in effect that nobody is. But nobody is because everybody is. Right? So then the question, it still comes back to what is it that people are doing that they so easily identify with aesthetics. There are many people who do what's sometimes called pragmatist aesthetics. They often start out by saying, well, aesthetics is everywhere, it's part of everyday life, and so aesthetics is easy. Right? It's sort of the given, we go on and we talk about politics and things like that. And I think that misses the point that if aesthetics is everywhere, or many more places than it used to be, it's difficult for that reason. It's a serious problem, and hence the issue about questioning aesthetics. Right? That needs some kind of clarification. So one of the things I wanted to clarify is that aesthetic, whether it's aesthetic computing or neuroaesthetics or any of these other fields, the aim is not to reduce those fields, and if you were talking about feminist aesthetics or film aesthetics, whatever, it's not to reduce those other disciplines or practices to their aesthetic dimension, because there is no aesthetic dimension. There's nothing, beauty or any aesthetic property is not a property of an object, so aesthetics is not, there's no aesthetic dimension of any practice exactly either. So it's not, so that the aim is not to reduce aesthetics to those disciplines to their aesthetic dimension, because there is no such thing. It's rather to introduce a broader notion of aesthetics that that attaches itself to the complex normative dimensions of these practices, whether it's art, science, computing, and individual arts like dance and so on. And by that I mean the kind of the normative dimension, meaning ethics, politics, those kinds of issues. And aesthetics then serves as a kind of organizing, I'm not sure what the best, I can't quite find the word that fits this, but what I'm looking for is, aesthetics is a coordinating discipline. Right? The others aren't, disciplines of practice are not reduced to their aesthetic dimension, but aesthetics is trying to coordinate the normative dimensions of those practices, so that they can deal with the aesthetic, the ethical issues, the political issues, the scientific issues, and so on. So the sense in which aesthetics is everywhere is that it can infiltrate and help to analyze the different types of normativity in these various practices. Right? And that there's a long history of talking about aesthetics in this way. I mean, one of the reasons I think Rancière is so popular is because he just goes back to the Aristotelian notion, the Greek notion of aesthetics as just meaning sensation and perception. And that means, it doesn't mean of what? I mean, it doesn't mean a perception of fine art. It doesn't mean perception of anything particular. It means perception, period. It's about as specific as breathing, right? So that's the breadth of aesthetics. So that has to be its strength, but it has to be clarified what aesthetics can add to these. So if a computer scientist says, well, what can aesthetics add? Well, aesthetics can add these conceptual tools to help identify, clarify, and critique the normativity, the complex normativity in these different kinds of practices, and so on. So, an example of aesthetic computing, my understanding of it, in part, the way it emerged with Paul Fishwick and others, is that people started worrying about the complexity of the users, realizing that users weren't these generalized other, that could be anybody. It was you or you with this particular person, that there were gender, there were racial, ethnic, sexual, other kind of differences, and that you, in thinking about computing and thinking about the user, you had to think it in that terms of that complexity. So they look to aesthetics thinking, well, they've been dealing with this sort of issue for a couple thousand years, thinking about various forms of subjectivity in our experience of objects or in these kinds of interfaces and so on. So they look to aesthetics. That volume that Fishwick edited, that's the way they talk about how they made the so-called aesthetic turn, right? So they were looking for, and that's an example in that particular case of aesthetic computing, what I mean by looking for aesthetics to help understand this normativity, this complex normativity and complex subjectivity. Okay. The other thing I wanted to say about the different titles of these, the when, so Julie, or I don't know who was it, said the only problem with when is our contemporary is the when, the contemporary, the art, and also the is. Part of the at least for my part, one of the inspirations for that is Nelson Goodman, the philosopher who wrote Languages of Art and many other things. But in the 60s, in Languages of Art, he said, look, philosophers should stop asking the question, what is art? They should stop approaching the question, and that the ontological question, by framing it in that way, because it almost, by the way the question was framed, committed you to some kind of essentialism. It was hard to get outside of essentialism, or some notion that there was, the answer would be art is blah, 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 in some sort of general, if not even universal sense. But if you just shifted the question from what is art to when is art, it immediately meant that it was contextualized, and that you had to understand the context within which it was possible for something, an object, to serve as this thing that we call a work of art, right? And so that it changed, aesthetics. I mean, aesthetics, unfortunately, within philosophy, philosophical aesthetics, although influenced by Goodman, hasn't really influenced by that turn that he made. They've been influenced by things about denotation and other kinds of things, but which make no sense for Goodman without that turn from the what, the simple turn from the what to the when. So that was at least on my part, as I said, the motivation for that when is art contemporary, when is computing aesthetic, when is art participatory, and then the next one is when is art political. And almost, to put it in that contextual way, means that you have to talk about different kinds of art forms at different periods from the perspective of different disciplines. To have panels where you have practitioners as well as theorists, as well as critics, and so on. You can't do justice to the when question without having that richness and so on. And we tried to do that with encyclopedia, but it's encyclopedia. It has a format. There's a limitation to it. One doesn't read it from cover to cover, or usually it's hit and run, one entry and you're out. So people often don't see that side of it. Okay. The last thing I wanted just to say, and this is more of an ill-formed question about trying to think about how these different panels fit together. There's a sense in which, why would these things be combined at all? Well, I mean, participatory art is a form of contemporary art, so it's hard to talk about what you mean by participatory art without also raising the larger question of contemporary art, of which participatory art would be sort of example. But similarly, aesthetic computing, or more narrowly sort of new media, digital art, is also, calls itself new media. It's considered then, it is then also an example of contemporary art. So participatory art and digital art. Just went out. The battery's dead. That's a hint. I'll take it as a hint. So I wanted to ask, is this working?
Yes.
The issue about the temporality, because in an odd way, Richard, your idea of the contemporary is a detachment from our now, so that we can be open to nows of the past. Right? So it's all art was contemporary. So there's a history of contemporary art that's contemporary moments that are no longer contemporary. That's why fashion is often the sort of model for that. So there's a sense in which there's a past orientation in the temporality, the temporal structure of it, in a sense. And talking about film, Jeffrey, that sense of retrieval, it's new in the past and something. So, but if I try to understand that sense of detachment, which of course is a central concept in various guises in the history of aesthetics, it's the kind of thing that people were anti when they're anti-aesthetic, the detachment, usually in the form of disinterestedness, usually under the name of Kant. He was the devil in the anti-aesthetic. But the return of detachment is a return of aesthetics in a strange kind of way. But then the temporality seems past-oriented, which strikes me to be in contrast to participatory art and aesthetic computing. Again, they are examples of something that contemporary in the sense that we mean now, so not yesterday, but now. So the very examples of the now, the contemporary, are out of line with the sense of contemporary that came out of not entirely out of the panel, but much of the focus out of the panel, like dance, modern dance is out of step, is the past, whereas the contemporary is what's on television or something of that sort. So there's a sense in which there's the participatory art, maybe more so than aesthetic computing or digital art, seems to me to have its eye on the future more than on the past. And in that sense, it's not contemporary in the sense that it's often talked about now. There isn't the same focus, but the future may be having, the focus on the future may have in common with the focus on the past, a sense of detachment. Both have a sense of being detached from the immediate notion of the present, of the now. Right? One may be looking for the way the past is still present in the present. The other is looking for a different kind of future. So in the panel on aesthetic computing, there was a lot of talk about the future, imagining the future in a different way from now. And while that sometimes is thought of as the contemporaneity of those of computing or participatory art, it is in a strange way what's not contemporary, because it's looking more to the future. So let me just close with the way I sort of frame this in thinking about Nietzsche, because the notion of the untimely comes up so much in talking about contemporary art. And the distinction that a tripart distinction that Nietzsche makes in the genealogy of morals between genealogy, critique, and what's called either transvaluation or reevaluation, transformation of values. I'll just take the sense of transformation that is future oriented. So the idea of the purpose of a genealogy was to understand the present, but with an eye to transforming it into some kind of future that was sort of undefined, uncertain. Some of the language that has come up in a number of these different panels, and that sort of captures the range of temporality. It captures both the past and the present. I think, Richard, in your book you quote, it was a Chris Wood and Alexander Nagel's book where they talk about a work of art being both retrospective and prospective at the same time. That's sort of what I have in mind. So that Nietzschean tripart distinction seems to capture that sense of we want to understand how the past is still present in the now, but we're doing this for the purposes of understanding the transformation. That may be a way of reconciling these seemingly different kinds of temporality. Because when you're talking about retrieving the past, it's not for nostalgic reasons. It's a transformation of the past from which you've detached yourself. The transformation of the past for the sake of the present from which you've detached yourself. So, okay, let me stop there. And if you have any other questions or comments or something.